everybody and lets me know that we can uh, start. Now, at the moment, the meeting is streaming live on
Not yet,
YouTube.
Carl, not yet.
Oh,
Now
well,
it
I
is.
got a message. It is.
Okay, now it is. Okay, and you've got 1 minute to go.
Is Bonnie there?
So everybody behave yourself for 1 minute.
What, did I see Bonnie a minute ago?
Her photo.
Yeah, I saw a frozen picture.
I
There
mean-
she is.
The
There
hair's
she
a
is.
different color now.
Oh, haven't seen you since our what is it, our toddler days,
Yeah, I know.
our student days. Good to see you.
Oh, thank you too.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's amazing how fast every time is gone, isn't it?
it really is. Yeah, we missed a lot of sessions with those children though.
Okay, and I see that Penny has joined us also, and
Good evening.
oh, Barbara's there as well. Good to see all of you. And Bob, you think we're about ready to go?
Hey.
Yeah,
Okay, Bob is going to mute everyone, and as we go along, if you do have questions, then remember that there is
wait a
the
minute.
function to raise your hand. And I don't know if he got everybody muted or not.
No, I don't, because I was in the wrong place, but I got it now.
Okay.
Well, there we're going
Self here.
See, I get two streams at the same time. Okay, mute all.
Technology.
All right, we're all muted, Carl.
Okay, so
And I'll go to speaker view, and you're on.
okay, thanks, Bob. Welcome to our third session on the Torah as part of Messiah's. And
I think I
there we
muted
go.
you.
Yeah, I unmuted myself. Again, welcome to our third session on Messiah's Comprehensive Bible Study. This one on the session 3 of the Torah. Just did post the handout for everyone and wanted to hopefully you had an easy time in terms of seeing the material, and also trying to there we go, share some material with you. This is from the handout. Just wanted to remind everyone of the goals of the study, mainly trying to learn some new thoughts and theories and consider ways that the Torah applies to us today. Those two scriptures that certainly govern how I'm trying to study for the sessions and prepare for them, and hope that those scriptures will help you as we are considering what's going on with the material. For a quick review tonight, we've talked in the past about biblical interpretation, and there are lots of factors that can go into our understanding of Scripture. And I believe the goal should be how it personally applies to each person. Hopefully, the expert exegesis and exposition can assist in that approach and help us be aware of cultural or other biases that we may have that might interfere with God's message for us. And communicating with God through prayer is definitely the way to go in trying to understand more of what God is saying to us through the Bible. We've also talked a little bit about 3 of the Bible themes that I'm focusing on. There's certainly a lot more in the Bible, but the idea that of election is that God chooses. He chooses people. He chooses groups of people to carry out his purpose. And he establishes covenants that typically include God's promise, an expected response from the people that he's making that promise to, and then some sign of the covenant. And finally, we talk about grace, which even though we often fail to live up to our terms of the covenant, God certainly does show grace to us and mercy beyond what we really deserve. Continuing on with our review, we talked about the Torah, teaching, Pentateuch, law, Talmud. Torah simply means teaching. It's a short reference to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. That's also referred to as the Pentateuch. One rabbi counted up about 613 laws contained within the 5 books of the Torah. And so these 5 books are often referred to as the law. And the Torah is really a lot more, though. It's the story of God's interaction with people and the covenants or agreements that God made with people to promise good to humanity while expecting people to revere and worship God, and also to observe the signs of the covenant that have been provided by God. Jewish people over the years have compiled the Talmud as the teachings and opinions of many, many, many rabbis, thousands of them probably, about how the Torah should be understood and followed. And a lot of the exegesis by Christian scholars also find some guidance in the Talmud as well. Moving on down, we talked the first session a little bit as we got into Genesis about the first 11 chapters, dealt with the 2 creation stories, God's initial covenantal blessing of humanity, the unfortunate response of disobedience resulting in a more difficult existence. But God showed mercy by not immediately killing Adam, as he was warned that he might die if he ate of the fruit of the forbidden tree. So as Adam and Eve began to live their lives and Cain killed his brother Abel, God showed mercy again. He didn't kill Cain in return for that. He did put a mark upon him so that other folks wouldn't kill him. As humankind spread about the earth, though, they certainly demonstrated a lot of evil that God had not intended, and he basically regretted he made the human race, planned to wipe them out, but again showed mercy, decided to save Noah, his family, had Noah build an ark, and sure enough, they survived and started repopulating the earth afterwards. And God made a covenant with Noah, said he'd never again destroy the earth in that way. As we said, there were a lot of other legends, traditions, stories about creation, about great floods, many of these things that seem similar in other cultures, which don't necessarily lessen the impact of the Bible stories, but are really compiled into the Bible in such a way as to try to demonstrate God's power over everything. That I think in the first session I mentioned someone had said, well, I believe in a God who's strong enough to have caused a flood like that. So whether it happened or not doesn't really matter. I believe that God could do that. Anyway, we continued on with those first 11 chapters, which ended with story of the Tower of Babel, where folks again wanted to be like God, wanted to build a tower that reached up to the heavens, and God said no, but he showed mercy. He didn't destroy them. He simply confused their language, spread them out over the earth. So the end of chapter 11 ended with a story about a man named Terah who left his town in Ur of the Chaldeans with part of his family, traveled about 600 miles up the Euphrates River to a place called Haran. And then we picked up last week with Genesis 12 through 27, where Abraham, or Abram at the time, was called by God to leave Haran and travel to Canaan. and he was given a promise by God that he would become a great nation, he would be a blessed, and he would be a blessing to others. So this was the first of many of the promises that were made by God to Abram, and most of them did concern land and descendants. Abram often built altars to worship the Lord, as was the custom in the area at that time. Uh, didn't really mention it, but there's been a lot of archaeological finds that give us a little bit more insight into the people who were living in that area at the time that Abram uh, came to the area. And many of the customs were similar to the way that Abram worshiped God, as far as building an altar, sacrificing, things like that. Uh, Soon after reaching Canaan, there was a famine, so Abram took his family down to Egypt where there was food. He was worried that he might be killed for his wife, so he told her to please tell everyone that she was his sister, and that worked. Of course, several chapters later, we did find out that supposedly she really was his sister, his half sister, the child of his father, but of a different mother. Abram had a nephew named Lot who moved to a different part of the country because they were both getting pretty prosperous there in Canaan. And Lot got into some trouble, but Abram rescued him from some kings. However, Lot was living near Sodom. And when the Lord decided to destroy that, since Lot was not evil like the other folks, and actually showed some hospitality to a couple of angels who came to town, they wound up rescuing Lot and his family from Sodom. Unfortunately, his wife disobeyed a command to look back, turned into a pillar of salt. Uh, Remember the verse in Luke which says, "Remember Lot's wife," another very short one to go along with Jesus wept. Anyway, Lot's daughters were fleeing with him, and Lot was afraid at that point to go into any of the towns in the area, so they lived in a cave. And the daughters decided, well, we need to have some heirs, and they got their father drunk, slept with him, and became the uh, people of the Moabites and the Ammonites, who were very often enemies of the Israelites, even though there were some interactions there, such as the fact that Ruth, a Moabitess, became the great grandmother of King David. While waiting for God's promises about descendants, Abram's wife Sarai got a little bit impatient, and so she followed another custom prevalent at the time and gave him her maid Hagar to sleep with so that he could have a child by her. And sure enough, Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. And Abram really said, hey, God, can Ishmael be my son of the promises that you've made to me? And that wasn't part of God's plan. So God came, gave him a new covenant of circumcision. And so Abram and all of his crew were circumcised. At the same time, he got a name change, which names were very important, had a lot of sense of identity in the region. And Abram, instead of being called a father, became Abraham, or a father of many nations. And same thing for his wife Sarai, she became Sarah, and which means princess because she was the mother of many nations. Now, within a year, uh, Sarah had kind of laughed still at the last time she overheard God making this promise to Abraham. But God said, is anything too hard for the Lord? And sure enough, a year later, she gave birth to Isaac. At that point, Hagar and Ishmael got sent away, but God watched over them, gave Ishmael lots of descendants as well. And if you look at the handout that was included with the for today's session, you'll see on the genealogy there of Abraham on the left side that Abraham through Hagar had Ishmael, and then Ishmael had 12 sons himself. But the main line of Abraham is traced through his wife Sarah and her son Isaac. So getting back to the story, Abraham did get tested by God. There was a practice that was prevalent at the time of child sacrifice, and the story is that Abraham was told by God to go take his only son Isaac and offer him up as a sacrifice, which he did. He was willing to do that. He went with the servant, loaded some wood for the fire for the sacrifice. They went to a mountain, which is usually held to be Mount Moriah or the Holy Mount in Jerusalem. And son was kind of wondering, where's the animal for the sacrifice? And about that time, Abraham grabbed him, tied him up, put him on the altar or on the fire that he was about to build. And at that point, an angel of the Lord said, Abraham, what are you doing? And instead, Abraham saw that there was a ram over in the bush, and God was pleased that Abraham was willing to go that far, but he really didn't want him to do that. So this is something that it could be seen as possibly an indictment of the practice of child sacrifice. Unfortunately, it didn't completely wipe it out because it continued for another 1,000 years or so, even into the reign of the later kings of Israel. So after that, Sarah died. Abraham realized that Isaac was kind of lonely. He sent his servant back to Haran to search among his relatives for a wife. And this is something that practice called endogamy, which means marriage within one's ethnic, cultural, or religious community. And Abraham made his servant swear that he would try to, get a wife from his relatives for his son Isaac. Sure enough, he was able to do that. Rebekah was willing to come back. And the servant had taken quite a bit of goods with him and gave some to Rebekah and then gave some to her family. So it was kind of a combination of a couple of practices that existed in sealing marriages, both dowry and bride price, and that Sarah got some of the stuff, the gold nose ring and gold bracelets as her dowry, but her family got a bride price for her as well. But in return, her family sent maids with her to go back as she was going back to meet Isaac and become his wife. It was kind of interesting in terms of the family dynamics once once Isaac and Rebekah had children. They had twins, and the kids were very different. Esau, the older one, was a big hunter, went out into the woods, and Jacob was quite different, a little more intellectual, you might say. But since Esau was the firstborn, he did have rights. One of them called a birthright, and that was simply the right to be really the family leader once his father passed away. Another right he had was the blessing, which at the time of his father's death he would receive, and um, it was basically a double portion of inheritance. So, as it turned out, Esau sold his birthright to Jacob in return for some stew when he was out, had been out hunting and was hungry. And then later, with the encouragement of Rebekah, Jacob stole the blessing that Esau was entitled to. Rebekah got some clothes, dressed him up as if he were Esau and sent him in to his dad. And uh, so Isaac gave that blessing to Jacob rather than to Esau, which naturally kind of ticked off Esau, and he started making plans to kill Jacob as soon as his dad passed away. Now, Esau, as far as the idea of endogamy, he didn't care for that at all. He uh, wanted a couple of wives, which polygamy was prevalent at the time, and he married a couple of Hittite women, and that gave a lot of trouble to both Isaac and Rebekah. So after Jacob had made Esau so angry, uh, they Rebekah decided she better get him out of there, and she told Isaac, "Let's go ahead and send him back to Haran to our family and look for a wife there who's one of us, as opposed to dealing with these Hittite women." So that's basically uh, what happened in terms of uh, the first couple of chapters that we've been going through, first half of the chapters of the book. And tonight we'll start off with chapter 28 and run through the end of Genesis. Now, 28 deals with Jacob's ladder to heaven at Bethel. Uh, he stopped there on his way. Bethel, according to a lot of the archaeology, was a pretty long-standing religious center, and they even had special stones there that could be used to put under one's head and hopefully bring about dreams. Of course, none of that is mentioned in the Bible story about it, just that Jacob did have the dream. He saw a ladder to heaven with a host of angels. And this was kind of rare to see a host of angels. Most time they were singular, even though a couple had appeared to Abraham along with the Lord. But he saw these angels up and down the ladder. He saw God at the top, and God promised Jacob land and descendants. So he received the same promise that his father Isaac had received and his grandfather Abraham had received. So in response, Jacob said, "Well, if you are with me and protect me, hey, you'll be my God, and I'll give 10% to you of everything that you give to me." So it shows again at that point Jacob's spirit was one kind of very much bargaining and trying to work things out. Anyway, he made it on to uh, Haran. He met Leah, who was actually his cousin, the son of Laban, his wife's brother. And he just fell in love with her at first sight. Uh, After a few days, he told Laban that he'd be willing to work 7 years in order to pay a bride price for Rachel. And sure enough, he worked 7 years. The wedding feast came. And unfortunately, the morning after the wedding feast, uh, Jacob found that he'd been married to Rachel's older sister, Leah. And Laban said, "Well, that's how we do things around here. The older one has to get married first. But tell you what, if you'll work another 7 years, then you can have Rachel, you know, wait till after this week of marriage celebration to Leah, and then you can have Rachel at that time as well. So marrying two sisters. Later on, we'll hear about a law kind of prohibiting that in Leviticus, and with good reason. There was a lot of competition back and forth between the two of them. So Leah realized that Jacob loved Rachel more, and according to the Bible, it says, well, God decided to bless Leah by giving her children. So she had 4 sons, while Rachel was not having any children. And at that point, Rachel said, well, wait a minute. I've got to go ahead and do something here. So uh, I'll give my maid, Bilhah, as a wife to Jacob. And sure enough, Bilhah had 2 sons. So Leah saw that going on, and she wasn't having any more kids. And so she wound up giving her maid Zilpah to Jacob as a wife. And she had 2 sons. So because Leah had done that, Leah then had 2 more sons and a daughter. So that's most of the numbers there. The final that are shown in your handout, the 4, 2, 2, 2, and D. And then that last one, though, is finally Rachel had a child, and favored son, Joseph. Well, at that point, working for 14 years was a pretty long time, and Jacob thought, well, maybe I ought to head for home now. And it's been long enough that Esau might not be too angry at me. But Laban had been prospering with Jacob working for him all this time. He said, "No, why don't you hang around and uh, we can work something out." And so they decided on part of the flock would actually become Jacob's. Unfortunately, Laban stole away with that part of the flock, and uh, so Jacob came up with his own plan, and with the help of God, he was able to increase the part of the flock that was to go to him. So finally, after about another 6 or 7 years, God appeared to Jacob and said, "Yeah, it is time, and you need to head back to Canaan." Jacob brought it up with his wives, and they actually agreed. They said, "Hey, our dad hasn't really treated us that well, so uh, we're ready to go." And when they left, Rachel decided she was really going to get at her dad and for the way he'd been treating him. And so she grabbed his household gods. And again, this was something prevalent at the time. Many, many folks had household gods and um, were very important to them. So it took a few days for Laban he was out away from home when Jacob took off with all his family and his flocks and everything. But when he realized that he was gone and his household gods were gone, he took off after Jacob and finally caught up with him. A place could be called Gilead. And when they got there, uh, they were some fussing back and forth. There was the issue about the household gods. Jacob said, I didn't take them. Search us. We don't care. And so they started searching around. When they came to to Rachel's tent, she was sitting on her saddle, and she had her household goods hidden underneath the saddle. And she told her dad, "Please excuse me that I don't get up, while you're in here, but it's my time of the month." And so Laban didn't want to mess with that, and so he didn't discover that she had taken the household gods. So Laban still wasn't real happy. Certainly wasn't happy about everybody leaving him, but decided, okay, uh, let's make an agreement, uh, make a covenant. And they did, and they each set up a heap of stones, uh, which Jacob called it Gilead, also known as Mizpah, which means witness or watchtower. And you may have, seen jewelry many times that are intended for, say, a husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend to share with a metal kind of split in half. And the legend on the metal is a quote from Genesis 31:49. May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. Of course, if you go to verse 50, this is what Laban was saying. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take any wives besides my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember that God is a witness between you and me. So it doesn't necessarily have the same romantic allure that perhaps it may once have had, but it's definitely an issue that, yeah, God is around. God is aware of everything that's going on. Anyway, Laban went back home. Jacob continued on his journey with his family. He was still a little bit worried about meeting up with Esau, so he uh, sent some gifts ahead, lots of gifts. And then he sent his family ahead. And he stayed behind. And when he did, he wrestled all night with God at the brook, the crossing of the river Jabbok. And for some, it sounds strange to us, but for some reason, God really wasn't prevailing until he touched Jacob in a certain spot on his hip and threw it out of whack. And uh, when he did, then at that point, they were about ready to let go of each other. And God said, let me go. And Jacob said, well, give me your blessing. And it's interesting that it's just described as a man here, said, well, what's your name? And he said, my name's Jacob. And the man said, well, that's no longer going to be your name. You're going to be Israel because you have struggled with God and men and have overcome. And at that point, Jacob wanted to ask him, what's your name? And he said, why do you ask my name? And he blessed him, and that was it. So Jacob called the place Peniel, which means face of God. So next chapter, Jacob and Esau met. Despite all his fears, Esau was very pleased to see Jacob, wondered at all the gifts that had been sent, the family members that he had, and was really impressed with that and said, hey, we'll come on back to the house. You can stay with me and we'll take care of you, all this kind of stuff. And Jacob said, well, all these herds and cattle and all the wives and the children, they move slow. So you go on ahead. We'll catch up to you later. But at least everything was good. So there at Shechem, Jacob stopped and he built an altar there. And they started to interact a little bit with the people of Shechem. And Jacob actually bought some land from them. And unfortunately, one of the princes of Shechem decided that he really took a liking to Dinah, the sister of all of Jacob's sons. And he liked her so much, he actually raped her. Again, things were certainly different in those days and even among the different societies that were living in those days. And he really wanted to make her his wife and sent his daddy to try to, talk to the folks about letting her become his wife. And he was going to pay any bride price that they would ask. Just, give me the girl as my wife. But Jacob's sons were very upset that their sister had been defiled. So they said, well, uh, we can't let you marry her unless you become like one of us. You know, kind of getting back to that endogamy thing that we talked about earlier within a culture, adopt some of our culture. So they said one of our big things is circumcision. So if you want to join our culture, all of you need to be circumcised. And all of uh, all the folks decided, yeah, it could be good because these folks are pretty prosperous. We can trade with them. Uh, we'll do that, and then Dinah can marry uh, the son of Shechem, or marry Shechem. And so they were circumcised, and unfortunately, that's as an adult, that's not the same process. It seems to get over so quickly in a baby. And they were still hurting about 3 days later when a couple of Jacob's sons, uh, Levi and Simeon, just went into the town and killed all the men and basically plundered the place, took everything away. And at that point, Jacob was pretty shocked by what his sons had done and said, people are going to hear about this. They're going to think bad of us, which all of his previous dealings, I mean, his deceit with his brother, his uh, deceitfulness with Laban in return for Laban's deceitfulness with him, he'd been kind of a shady character. Uh, some of the scholars say perhaps it was that wrestling with God that changed his character. That in addition to getting a new name, he got a new character, and so he was really embarrassed by what these sons had done. Uh, Other folks may have thought that it was the way that he was received by Esau, where he had feared meeting his brother again for so long, and yet his brother was happy to receive him, and basically was extending grace to him for all the deceit that he had showed his brother. So it was something that had happened to Jacob in the journey from Haran back toward Canaan, and he had a whole different attitude toward things. So he wandered around in the area a little while. He worshiped God. God promised him more land and descendants. As he was moving south toward Bethlehem, Rachel gave birth to Benjamin, and in the process died. And she was buried there on the road to Bethlehem. Those of you who have been to Israel and been along that road know there's a spot marked for Rachel's tomb. And soon afterwards, Jacob moved on to the area of Mamre or Hebron. And at that point, Isaac, his dad, died. And Jacob and Esau both went ahead and buried him. So they were again together as a family. And it was perhaps pointing out how important family came, even distant relatives that had been apart for so long, but they were still family. Now, chapter 36 basically has a list of Esau's descendants. And if you look at the handout, you'll see that the last page of that, which again I included, but don't know that you necessarily needed to print it or not. But Esau's relatives, he had the two Hittite wives, had a lot of kids by them. But after Jacob had gone away to Haran to search for kinfolk, Esau had decided he'd marry a relative as well. So he married Mahalath, who happened to be a daughter of Ishmael. And then there's some display of the chiefs of Edom, things like that on the display as well. Okay, back to the story of what happens though. It really turns into Joseph's story from that point on, even though Jacob is, or Israel is still around. And in chapter 37, there's a story of Joseph's dreams. Jacob really favored him over all the other brothers and gave him that coat, special coat, of course, the song, coat of many colors. And that simply engendered a lot of sibling hatred toward Joseph. So when his brothers had the chance, he'd already given his dad a bad report about him, and he decided that he went out after them again. Finally, located them at Dothan, where they were tending the flocks, and they threw him into a cistern. At first, they were thinking of killing him, but Reuben said, "No, let's not do that." But then, while he was away, the other brothers saw the Ishmaelites, and most Bible translations also mention the term Midianites, which again was one of the children of Ishmael. So, excuse me, not one of the children of Ishmael, but one of the children of Abraham by his second wife, Keturah, who he had way back there, but we kind of skipped over that. Anyway, it's all in the family. So these folks were heading on the way down to Egypt, and his brothers decided, well, we won't kill him. We'll sell him as a slave, get a little money. And they took his robe, put some goat's blood on it, and showed it to their father and said, "Isn't this the robe of your son?" And of course, Jacob was extremely sad at that. Next story is an interesting interlude with Judah and Tamar. And Judah, you don't know why he was singled out for a little bit of story while he was still in Canaan, but he decided to go ahead and get married, and had three sons, Onan, and Shelah. And the oldest one, married a girl by the name of Tamar. But he didn't have any children, and he was an evil person, so God killed him. And when he died, of course, you've heard the custom of brothers taking over. And the next oldest brother is supposed to marry a widow if the first son was childless, and then any children that they have would become considered children of the older son. So they did that, but Onan didn't like the idea of having children for his brother, so he spilled his semen, and God didn't like him doing that, and so he died. And at that point, that left the third son, Shelah, and Judah was a little bit worried at that point since two of his sons had died, and he said, "Well, wait till the kid grows up a little bit more, and then we'll give him to you as a husband." And they waited and waited, but Tamar saw that Judah didn't seem to be very anxious in getting her another husband, so she went out, played a prostitute with Judah, and became pregnant. And Judah was certainly upset when he heard about it, said, "Oh, well, she was, a pledge to my family. She shouldn't be acting as a prostitute." And he was about ready to kill her until it was revealed this seal, cord, and staff were actually what Judah had given this unknown prostitute as a pledge of future payment, and had disappeared when he sent that payment back. And it turned out that, of course, it was Tamar that was acting as a prostitute. So when she showed the seal, cord, and staff as the father, representing the father of her children, uh, Judah relented and brought her into his house to live, even though he didn't have relations with her. And she gave birth to a couple of twins, uh, Perez and Zerah. And that's actually how the lineage of Judah is traced through those sons, uh, one of whom became an ancestor of King David, and on down to Jesus. So after that interesting interlude, get back to the story of Joseph and what happened to him. God was with him. Uh, he was in the house of Potiphar, the one of Pharaoh's officials, captain of the guard, and the Lord was with him. And according to 39 verse 2, uh, Joseph did real well. He prospered there. He was pretty much in charge of everything. Unfortunately, Potiphar's wife had a roving eye and kind of liked what she saw in Joseph, tried to uh, get him to like her in return, and he did not. So she falsely accused him of rape, and he got thrown into prison. But even though he was in prison, verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph again and blessed him there. And the prison jailer decided to really show him favor, put him basically in charge of everything. And it just so happened that in the next chapter, a couple of Pharaoh's officials got thrown into prison, one of them being a cupbearer and one of them being a baker. And they both had dreams, and they wondered what these dreams meant. And Joseph said, well, uh, you know, interpretations belong to God. But he apparently felt close enough to God that he would listen to their dreams and see if God would tell him the interpretation. The cupbearer's dream meant good things. 3 days he was going to be restored to his position. Unfortunately, the baker's dream meant that in 3 days he was going to lose his head. Sure enough, the dreams came true, but unfortunately, the baker forgot Joseph. I mean, the cupbaker. Well, the baker definitely did, since he was no longer around. But the cupbearer forgot Joseph once he got restored to his position, and didn't think about him again until Pharaoh started having some dreams, and he had a couple of strange dreams that kind of jiggered the memory of the cupbearer. And he said, when I was in, when I kind of messed up a while back and was in prison, there was this Hebrew there that could interpret the dreams for me and for your baker, and sure enough, they came true. So they called for Joseph, cleaned him all up, and dressed him well. And sure enough, he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams that it meant there were going to be 7 years of great harvest on the land, and then 7 years of famine. And they were trying to figure out, well, what should we do? And Joseph gave them a good action plan, about storing up stuff during the years of plenty for the years of famine. So Pharaoh actually put Joseph in charge of everything. He was definitely prospering. Now, once the years of plenty were over and the famine came along, Joseph's brothers were still up in the land of Canaan with their dad Isaac, and with their dad Israel. And at that point, Israel said, well, go down to Egypt. They got food there, buy some. They went down. They actually got to meet Joseph, who recognized them, but they didn't recognize him as an Egyptian, all dressed up. And he treated them rather harshly, but did agree to sell them grain, but then had their money put back in their sacks. So when they left, and in addition to that, as they were talking, he said, well, they told him, happened to mention, he asked them, and they mentioned that, yes, we do have a younger brother. And so he said, well, the next time you come down for grain, you're going to have to bring that younger brother. And in order to ensure that you do, one of your other brothers is actually going to stay here, Simeon. So sure enough, they went back home. They told their dad what had happened, that Simeon was still in Egypt and, wouldn't be able to be returned unless uh, they went back and took Benjamin along with them, which Israel just wanted to have no part of doing. But uh, eventually, the food was out. They didn't have anything else they could do. So uh, Israel said, okay, take him, but please, make sure he lives. Don't let anything happen to him. And as they went back, uh, when they got back there again, uh, they did admit to the servants that, hey, our money appeared in our bags. We didn't take them. We don't know what happened. And the servant said, must have been your God that did that for you, because we got paid for the grain, no problem. Well, Joseph saw him come back, saw Benjamin, and threw a big feast for him, and treated Benjamin really well at the feast, but didn't let on still that they were his brothers or anything, and he sent them on their way. But when he did, he had his servant include his uh, cup, silver cup, in with the grain of Benjamin's bag. And then he sent his servants after them. When they all came back and they were just, oh no, what are we going to do? And he said, well, it's only the young one, that had my silver cup that's going to suffer. And uh, everybody else was offering to take his place. Judah said, no, I'll be your slave. Just let the boy go. It'll kill my dad. And so finally, Joseph couldn't take it any longer, and he revealed himself, uh, what had been going on. Uh, Chapter 45 and verse 5, he said, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. And then in verse 8, so then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. So there's lots of weeping during the reunion. They sent carts back to Canaan. They brought Israel and all the rest of the family down there. Bible says 66 folks moved down there, and of course 4 were already there. Joseph, his wife Asenath by that time, and his sons Manasseh and Ephraim. They got down there. Pharaoh gave them the land of Goshen to take care of all their flocks and livestock. And as Jacob was getting older, he decided it was time to bless the sons of Joseph. And when he did, he put his right hand on Ephraim, who was a younger son. And it was kind of reminiscent of, supposedly he was the younger son, yet he wound up with all the blessings. He was doing the same for Joseph's kids, and giving the greater blessing to Ephraim than to the older one, Manasseh. And then as Israel got a little bit worse, he wound up blessing all of his sons. And some of the blessings sound very strange, while others sound very nice and very appropriate. And some of the things he called his sons, you really wonder about that. And Israel finally passed away. So when he died, though, he made Joseph and the brothers promise that they'd take him back to Canaan to be buried. So there was a big to-do, big funeral procession up that way. The brothers, when they got back, they were kind of scared, and with their dad gone, they were not sure if Joseph was still holding any grudges or not, and they actually bowed down to him, which was kind of like what their sheaves had done back in the dream that Joseph had reported to him as a teenager. But Joseph didn't want revenge. Again, he believed that God had planned it all. And in verses 19 through 20 of chapter 50, he said, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives.'" So Joseph trusted the Lord all his life. Uh, he trusted the Lord near the end of his life, and he expected that the Israelites would eventually return to the promised land. And he made them promise to him that they would take his bones with him when they left, which kind of sets up the next chapter of the Pentateuch, of the Torah. So that's an awful lot of history covered in Genesis, a lot of customs different from our own, but a lot of things that we see today: sibling rivalry, uh, other rivalries among relatives, uh, some folks trying to take revenge, like Simeon and Levi did against the Shechemites, and other folks just horrified by, the violence that was uh, perpetrated upon those people. I don't see any hands up. I'm wondering if anyone did have any questions. We're just about out of time, but we do have room for a question or two if you have any. Jerry has a question. Can you unmute yourself? Jerry, you're not unmuted yet. Not unmuted yet.
Is on mute.
There you go. Okay.
Oh,
You're ready.
good. I finally found the button. We've made a lot of progress tonight.
Okay.
Well, my question had to do with, and maybe you could expound on it next time because you might need to think about it for a while. But as you give us the details of all these family relations and family stories, I can't help but ask, how are these family stories relative to us today? Can you bring the relationship of some of these occurrences to us? And I know that's a hard question to answer. Otherwise, I wouldn't be asking it. But that's the question that keeps coming in my mind as you relate these family stories to me. So if you've got any thoughts on those mine that you could share with us, why
Okay. Yeah, I think sometimes it's a matter of, hopefully we don't see some of the problems that are there. I know some folks have said at times that, well, the Bible stories are basically telling you about how not to live so that you will know how to live. That very many of them contain problems that go on, how people treat one another unfairly, evilly. Uh, Here the story of Jacob that we talked about so much tonight, where uh, his brother, had this own type of kind of freewheeling personality, and not too concerned about anything. And maybe some folks like that, and so Jacob kind of took advantage of him, and it created a lot of strife and almost led to his death before he could get away and go to his uncle's house. And
Well,
there are a lot of, I guess, you look for similarities, but you may also look for differences and say, I want to be sure that I don't do something like those particular people do, like Jacob cheating his brother as he went away and got cheated in turn by his uncle with respect to the marriage, first to Leah, and when he was expecting to be married to Rachel first, things like that. So
Yeah.
that's part of it. But yeah, I think we could all think a lot about, how do these stories relate? Uh, a lot of what's in here too, though, are the verses that I tried to point out tonight about the fact that folks recognize God at work in their lives. That sometimes, especially with Joseph, it seemed like, you know, he had his own agenda and his brothers had theirs, and could have created a lot of problems for him. But the story seems to indicate that God was present, and God blessed him, and gets back to one of those themes of election, and also the theme of mercy, that God shows mercy to folks who, uh, certainly Joseph was pretty arrogant as a kid when he's having these dreams and saying, I'm going to be Lord over all. But God perhaps was at work in the way that his brothers reacted, and in bringing him down a little bit, and that helped in terms of his later humility, in terms of being able to give God the credit for interpreting dreams, and resulted in his elevation to a place of great prominence.
That's a good thought that you've given me that I've never heard expressed before, that a lot of Bible stories tell you how not to live. That's an interesting thought. I've never heard it expressed that way before.
Okay, and we have a question from Pete too, I think.
Carl, would you mind if I took a shot at his question?
Sure, go right ahead. Be glad.
One of the tie-ins between these stories and us today links through Abraham and the covenants, and the way Paul in the New Testament cites all of those in Christ as being the children of Abraham. And so in order for that to make any sense, we have to have some assessment of who Abraham was and what his role in Israel and in the promises of God are. And then, of course, as Carl pointed out, we get the lineage to David through Tamara that ties to Jesus. And so we've got a lineal heritage background that goes back through Tamara and all the way back to Abraham. So that's one of the practical ways of why does this tie in to what we are today.
Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Pete. And
Thank you, Pete. Yeah.
I don't see any other hands raised. So if that's the case, I imagine the video will be posted in a few days, and we'll hopefully see everyone next week for another session as we get into a different book of the Torah, the Exodus. So thank you all for being here, and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Very good.